This is our penultimate talk now in the series of lectures this spring, so you'll get to see me once more next week. I'll remind you at the beginning here to turn off your cell phones, and that at the end I'm going to be coming around with the mic when you have questions so that we can capture them on tape, since these are being taped. When I looked at the title of tonight's talk, I thought, boy, I didn't know Bill Wissner was a fan of Coleridge. And you may say, you didn't know it either, because that's where that quote comes from. I ask my class this as an extra credit question each term when we talk about water and why salty water is not good to drink. It causes your cells to actually shrink. It's saltier outside than inside, so the water moves out of the cells into your stomach to dilute the salty water there. It's called crenation. And this is found as a quote in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, where the quote goes, "Water, water everywhere, and all the boards did shrink. Water, water everywhere, nor not a drop to drink." So as I say, we've got a lecture not only schooled in geology, but also in fine literature. Although I did look at the title and think he's rather narrow-minded. Of course, as a chemist, we're looking at H2O, and he's so narrow-minded that he's only considering it in one phase, which is the liquid phase that we call water. I mean, there is ice and there is steam too, so maybe one of these years you can branch out a little bit more. So Bill received his BA in geology from the College of Worcester. He received an MS in geology from the University of Florida. Got a second MS in water resources management and a PhD in geology. It says hydrogeology with a minor in civil and environmental engineering from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Bill has been teaching applied hydrogeology at the University of Montana since 1981, including classes in hydrogeology, advanced hydrogeology, groundwater modeling, applied groundwater modeling, surface water-groundwater interaction, and groundwater remediation. He has mentored over 75 graduate students, published 65 journal articles, and presented 190 talks at professional meetings. Last year, over 50 invited formal lectures were presented as the Bertzel Dreiss Distinguished Lecturer for the Geological Society of America's Hydrogeology Division. That's a lot of talks. You work it out. Professor Wissner is also active on university committees, serving 5 terms on faculty senate, and he has served on 4 committees of the National Academy of Sciences National Research Council. In the last few years, he formed the University of Montana Center for Riverine Science and Stream Renaturalization with his colleague Johnny Moore. I noticed some pamphlets out on the table at the entrance to introduce you to this particular aspect of his work. I also noticed that he put free samples out there of the topic of tonight's talk, which is potable water. The last thing that is on my introduction is to acknowledge that for his dedication to teaching, research, and service at the University of Montana, he's been named a Regents Professor in 2004, which is the highest, most prestigious rank available for UM faculty. So with that, I'll let Bill take over.
Thank you, Garen. Boy, I better not screw this up, is all I'm going to say. Well, thanks, Garen, for that nice introduction. And I don't really have any experiments to run tonight, so those bottles of water we're going to talk about in a little bit. And I saw Steve Running come in, and I said, well, if there's any hard questions, we'll just ask Steve what the answer is for that. But does anybody have any questions for Garen's introduction, though? I mean, about Well, let's get started. And I guess, to get started on this subject, as we were choosing topics, and they said, well, why don't you talk about water? Well, okay, well, that's kind of a big subject to talk about. So I guess I want to know your expectations. So here's my title. What am I going to talk about tonight? So what do you think I'm going to actually present in this discussion tonight? Give me some ideas. What do I mean by it? What do you think you're going to hear tonight? Yes?
Availability of salty water that's good to drink, that doesn't have like giardia and
Okay, the comment was the availability of good quality water to drink that doesn't have giardia or other things in it. So something about water availability. What else? What else are you going to hear about tonight?
the power struggle over water.
The power struggle over water was another comment. What else?
Groundwater depletion.
Groundwater depletion. Oh, that sounds interesting. Who's going to talk about that? No. What else? A couple of other things. Garen.
Septic systems in the Missoula Valley.
Septic systems in the Missoula Valley. That seems like we're really getting narrow now. Anything else? What? Global warming. No, we heard a talk about global warming. Steve Running gave a talk about global warming. But we'll see. That's interesting because we'll see if there's some connection here in some of this. Yes. Desalinization. Go ahead.
If global warming is affecting groundwater.
Is global warming affecting the groundwater? Anything else? Another comment?
Ownership and marketing of water.
Ownership and marketing of water. Okay, that's enough.
Yeah.
Boy, am I in big trouble. No, I'm actually going to talk about these subjects. And so we're going to start out by talking about the world water budget, just briefly, to get us all up on the same level. Then we're going to talk about the world water supply issue, which this young gentleman raised, as far as kind of where is the water and how much is out there. And then we're going to look at the U.S. and then look at Montana and some selected state issues. And then we're going to take a break. And you're all, that's why I gave you that water. You're all going to be sitting around hoping that break is coming soon, So, and then after that, sort of the second part of this discussion, because, see, they do give you 2 hours, right? I mean, this is a 2-hour class, and I know you want to get your money's worth. So the second part of this presentation will be on a particular subject, and that's some recent research that we've just completed that relate to pharmaceuticals and their presence in water. And that will be the topic of our second discussion. And actually, the septic system issue is going to come into play because we'll focus on the presence of pharmaceuticals in septic wastes, and do they get into the underlying groundwater and drinking water supply. So that's the kind of subjects that we're going to talk about this evening. So, okay, you have your first test question, and that is get some participation, or at least get you thinking about that. Let's build the world water budget. Now, some of you think, oh, this is a piece of cake, right? So if you look at these subjects as part of the world's water budget and think, where is all the water in the world? If you parse it up or divide it up in that group, the question will be, where's the most amount of water versus the least amount of water in that grouping? And it's easy, right? What's the first one? Where's all the water? In the oceans, okay? So we know that. And then where's the second amount of water? Ice caps, okay? What's the third? Oh, sort of quiet out there, aren't you?
Groundwater.
Groundwater I have out here. Any other ideas? Atmospheric. Lakes and rivers. Well, it looks like this. Okay, so if we look at it, 97% of the world's water, of course, is in the oceans. 2% is frozen up in ice caps and glaciers and in various parts of the world. And 0.6% is in the groundwater system. And less than 0.02% is in the surface water and lakes. Interesting, right? Think about where we get water from. So, of course, there's our kind of world water balance. Now, what about the fresh water? So that's fine, but I'm not too interested in the oceans. They're very important, but let's talk about water use and water consumption. So let's talk about the fresh water. So if we think about 97% of the water is in the oceans, the fresh water makes up 3% of that. And if we take that fresh water and start seeing how that's divided, we have about 80% of that water would be frozen in the ice caps. So see, Garen, I did mention ice. See? And 20% of that is in the groundwater, but still only, again, a very small percentage of that water, fresh water, is actually in the rivers and lakes. And then we take the groundwater and the river water and we move it down to what we would call easily accessible fresh water. And we find that in that block that 52% are in lakes and reservoirs, and then the groundwater makes up about 32%. But as far as the other water, the rivers, again, are a very small portion of the total available fresh water. So that's kind of how it breaks out. And we're going to talk mostly about fresh water in this category as easily accessible resource. And as we get started on that, water is measured in all kinds of different units. And so if we think about it, just to try to get you thinking about volumes of water, because if we talk about the world's water, we have a lot of water to talk about. So let's look up here. So we start with a quart, 1.06 of a quart. That's just a little more than a quart is actually what a liter is, right? And so we have our quart up here, and then we have a gallon, and we know that there's about 4 liters in 1 gallon. And if somebody talks about 1 million gallons per day, that's like a well pumping 700 gallons a minute all day, right? So that's the kind of equivalent when you hear those kinds of numbers. Then we go to a cubic foot. If you're down measuring the Clark Fork River, you talk about cubic feet of water moving by, and that's just the volume that's 1 foot by 1 foot by 1 foot. It's, when you go camping and you get one of those collapsible plastic jugs, and you take it over to the water fountain and you fill it up, that's about 5 gallons. It's a little less than a cubic foot, but it's pretty close to a cubic foot if you think about it. So that's what a volume of a cubic foot is. And then we move up to cubic meters. I'm going to use a lot of metric units. Oh, see this over here? Where's Ron Wakamoto when you need him, this is a little clip art here, and I can't get it to stop doing that. So, But 1 cubic meter here is, of course, 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter, 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet, or yard by yard by yard. And that's about 35 cubic feet, or over 260 gallons, 1,000 liters. And then we have a cubic kilometer. And that's really big, right? That's 1 billion cubic meters. That's a whole lot of water. And then we use units in the US here of acre feet when we're talking about agricultural units of water measurement. I just thought I'd throw that up there. An acre foot is pretty simple to conceptualize. It's a 1 acre piece of land that's covered 1 foot deep by water. It's that volume of water which will cover 1 acre area, 1 foot deep. And it's equal to about 43,000 cubic feet, or about 320 some gallons of water. It's a lot of water. Okay? So when we talk about these big numbers, we often use things like cubic kilometers and acre feet and cubic meters, and when we're trying to think of that. So let's just get you some ideas of what those numbers mean as you're thinking about them. Okay, world water use. Well, here's it is, 1900 to 2000. This is in cubic kilometers of water. And the world water use in 2000 was 5,000 cubic kilometers, which is 1.3 quadrillion gallons. Okay, that's how much water the world is using on an annual basis. And where are we using that? Well, we're using it mostly in agriculture, right? That's the bottom part of this graph. Where else do we use it? Well, industrial. Well, that started out, of course, with not much industry going on in the world, but now the industry is actually growing quite rapidly, and here's the municipal supplies. So agriculture is the main player, industry is starting to grow, and we have what looks like a logarithmic climb in water use from the world. Now, are these water resources renewable, right? Are they replenishable? Well, sure. We have a cycle that goes on, an annual cycle. Water's coming out of the ocean, it's raining on the land, water's running off. And so the idea is that if this thing is recycling the water year after year, that's good news, because as we use some more will come back the next year if all works well. But this freshwater availability really depends on spatial and temporal scales, on the space, the positions, and the timing of this. And in some cases, certainly, you have water which you use, you put in wells, or you use water and consume it, and it's actually non-renewable. You're taking more of it away each year in that area than can be replenished naturally. So it's just like your bank account. You go to the savings account and you take out some money, and if you don't put any back in, eventually you ain't going to have any left, right? So it's basically the same concept. We call that mining the resource. We're taking out more, taking it away faster than it will be renewed. But this renewable part of the resource is kind of important. So if we look at the world's renewable resources, what kind of water do we have out there? Well, here's the world, and this is in cubic kilometers. There's 42,000 cubic kilometers of renewable water in the world. And if you divide that by the world's population, it means everyone in the world would have 7,000 cubic meters a year of water, and that's a lot of water, okay? Well, how much do we actually use in the world? Well, we have this available, but we actually use something about 4,000 cubic kilometers of water. That diagram we just saw, close to 5,000. There's a little bit different data. And if we divide that by the world's population, each man, woman, child has basically about 700 cubic meters of water a year available to them. Ah, well, okay, that sounds pretty good. So that means we've got plenty of water out there, lots of water around. If we look at the U.S., we have this volume of available water. This is if we divide by our population, we have beaucoup water around as far as that availability. What are we really using? A very small portion of that, and that means that we have about 2,000 cubic meters of water per person. Again, that's a lot of water. We're going to take a look at this in just a minute. If we go down to Africa, though, we have a little different story. The available water is fairly small compared to some of these. The per capita here is still looks pretty good. What are we actually doing in Africa? We're using about 200 cubic kilometers of water, and we only have about 300 cubic meters of water per person per year that's available. Look at that compared to the U.S. as far as water availability. Well, of course, there's another problem, that this isn't evenly distributed, of course. That the water that's available is available in places like the Amazon River, and that's great, but that isn't going to help us if we're over in Africa someplace. So the colors on here, the salmon color and the mustard color and the lighter green color here are in categories that less than 1,000 cubic meters per person per year is considered to be water scarcity regions, and water stressed regions are less than 1,700 cubic meters per year. And you can see that those, even the U.S. here is in the next color up. It's in the 17 to 4,000 range, most of it. But the dry parts of the world is, of course, where we're in these water scarcity and these water stress kind of areas. So the distribution, even though we have a lot of renewable water, it's not all out there and available. If we look at water scarcity and stress by the number of countries that would be classified less than 1,700 cubic meters of water available per year, in 1995 we had about 31 countries, and that was 0.46, and this is in billions, so that's 400 million people that were in that situation. It's predicted by 2025 that there'll be 48 countries. We'll have 2.8 billion people who are in water stress situations. And as we go to 2050, we'll have over 4 billion people in that particular setting. So that's pretty interesting if we think about resources. We're all worried about oil and gas. Well, there's other things to be concerned about. Okay, well, there's also losing water because of other things that happen, and one of them would be by contaminating it in a way in which it makes it not usable as far as potable water. And so this just, it's a lot of words, but it's kind of interesting. So the loss of fresh water by pollution. Agriculture is the biggest polluter as far as the worldwide, because of course we use most of the water in agricultural settings. So we also find that in industrialized countries, we have rivers in Europe. Most of the rivers have high nitrates from agriculture in their river systems. So they have to be treated. The cost now of that water starts to rise. In Poland, look at that. 75% of the rivers are so polluted they can't even be used by industry, by the factories. Can't draw the water out and use it to process things. And in developing countries, it's basically saying here that most of the situations is that there's no sewage treatment. The waste disposal, there's raw sewage going into the systems, and so we have a mess. And here's a statement down here. Over 50,000 kilometers of major rivers in China no longer support fish life. Pretty amazing. I mean, I remember going to the ocean one time with my family, and the kids going out and swimming in the ocean off the New Jersey coast, coming back sort of having rashes on them. And I'm thinking like, well, what's going on? Are we contaminating the oceans? I mean, this is a big body. How can we do that? How can we have such an effect on the system? And again, this is hard to imagine, but we have large quantities of water which we have major impacts due from contamination. And then there's another dimension which relates to waterborne disease issues, which you may or may not contribute to waste disposal or other things or water availability, but it's kind of another issue just to keep in mind. But this means that and when you look at the statistics, over 1.1 billion people in the world risk access to fresh water, to clean water supplies. Okay? Well, it seems like we should do something about that, doesn't it? Well, let's now look at a couple of just examples. And I've just chosen 3 to kind of look at. And this is a water scarcity issue. And we'll take you to Northern Africa and the Middle East here. And again, we're going to talk about the lack of water. In Northern Africa, it has about 2.5% of Africa's total renewable water. But it uses 46% of all the water that's being used in Africa. Okay? And if we look at these countries, and the water-stressed countries in these regions here, and including the Middle East here, in 1959 there were only 3 that fit in this category, this volume of water. By 1990 there were 11, and by 2025 there'll be 17. So again, I think it was Anwar Sadat when he signed the peace treaty there back in the 70s about war. He said one thing, he said, "I won't go to war again unless it's over water." And this is a gigantic issue. Well, how can they do this? How can they have so little water and use so much of Africa's water? Well, what they do is that they use this sandstone aquifer here, which covers 4 countries, Egypt, Libya, the Sudan, and Chad. It's called the Nubian Sandstone Aquifer, and it has what we call fossil groundwater in it. Groundwater that was recharged or added into the system during the last ice age. I mean, it actually stopped raining about 3,000 years ago in this area, and now we have wells drilled in here that we extract water. So here we have the water, and we start extracting the water, and we extract it faster than we can replenish it, so we start to mine or take that water out of the system. If we're now standing, this is a block diagram that kind of shows the position of this aquifer in these countries. Here's the Mediterranean Sea, so this is to the north. And it's interesting because this aquifer, they actually discovered some water resources by flying NASA images over it with radar and looking down through the sands and seeing old channels buried beneath the sands, and then they'd find a whole bunch of irrigation going on in wells and oases, and they were all related to these big old channels which were channeling underground water out in the system. So they actually did some discovery and placing of wells like this. Well, Libya decided, hey, there's all kinds of water down there. Why don't we go get that water and move it up to the coast where all the people are? So Libya started a project where they started producing 3 million cubic meters a day. That's coming out of 361 wells that are pumping at about 2,000 gallons a minute. So there's a bunch of wells pumping groundwater out of the system. And they have pipelines which run 700 kilometers and 300 kilometers from the sandstone aquifer to the coastal area. They're going to have a third phase, which is going to have double this amount of production, and they're going to spend about $32 billion to move this fossil groundwater up to the coast. And what are they going to do with it when it gets up to the coast? Well, they're going to give it to the people to drink, and they're going to use it for agriculture. But the issue is that eventually this is a non-renewable resource. They're going to draw the system down, and they're basically going to use up that water, and it will not be replenished in the time that they are going to extract it. And that some people predict that is up to 20 to 25 years at the rates that they're currently withdrawing it from those areas of the system. And there's a quote up here from the water minister that says, "The question has never been, should we mine water or not?" This is a Libyan water minister talking. Rather, it's been, if we don't find a solution to the water shortage, we will face a very dark future. Well, let's shift gears. What if we move to another part of the world? Here's a place where there's all kinds of water. We'll go to Bangladesh. Bangladesh is right next to India here, and here's the country outlined here. And we have major river systems coming down from the Himalayas and from India in here from the mountains and depositing sediments down in here and discharging out into the ocean. Now, the sediments that are being deposited from just the weathering of the rocks in the mountains are nothing very unusual. They're kind of have general chemistry just like sediments that you might see in an area anywhere. And so they're being deposited and rapidly buried in this area here. And as a result of that, something's happening because the people there are drinking water with elevated arsenic concentrations. And it's not just a few people. The whole population of Bangladesh is 144 million. With a drinking water standard at 50 milligrams per liter, there's 35 million people. That's all these colors. I'll show you another map of this, but any place where there's a bunch of colors, you're exceeding standards. There's 35 million people drinking water which exceed the standard of 50. What's the standard for the US right now? Just changed. It was 50. It's 10. Okay. Well, if you look at the standard that we use, 10, 57 million people are now drinking water in Bangladesh, which exceeds that. Now, the challenge is that they're not drinking water that just exceeds it a little bit, because this is the consequence of drinking that water. And you actually have arsenic poisoning cases in Bangladesh. And so here again are the areas of Bangladesh. The brighter colors here in green and above are all exceed the standard of 10, and they get up to 1 or 2 parts per million. That's extremely high for dissolved arsenic in the water. Now, the question is, why in the world are these people drinking water full of arsenic? And the issue is that they didn't used to do that. In 1970, people came in, the British government came in and others and said, hey, look, everybody's dying from waterborne disease. What we need to do is to drill some wells for you so that you can drink the groundwater and you won't be impacted by that waterborne disease. You'll have clean water. So they put in these things called tube wells, which are just small diameter wells which go down 30 to 100 feet, 10 to 30 meters, and you pump water out of them and you drink the water. Well, when they started testing then people started looking like this. And so when they did that, they said, well, something's going on. They tested the wells, and the shallow tube wells in most of the country had extremely high concentrations of arsenic in it. So the question was, why is that? If the sediments are not from mining, it's not an anthropogenic issue, this is a naturally occurring situation, why are the people drinking water with the arsenic in it? Well, they looked at the sediment chemistry, and some people said, well, we think it's because there's these sulfide minerals that are weathering out of the rocks, and they get buried in the sediments, and just naturally they wash down out of the mountain. And then as you pump water out of these wells, it makes the water table drop and rise and drop and rise. And when it drops down, oxygen gets in there, and it actually oxidizes some of these sulfide minerals, and it releases arsenic. And that's why everybody's drinking this. Well, the problem is that they did some studies and they couldn't figure out, they really weren't dropping the water table very much and having the water table rise very much. It was always really high because Bangladesh is flooded most of the time. So they decided that's not a good explanation. That doesn't hold up. So then they started looking and they said, well, maybe what's happened is that as we washed those clean sediments down there, we had a lot of oxyhydroxides, which are like that red iron-looking flock that you see when you walk along the bank of a river and you see sort of water seeping out of it. And that actually locks up natural arsenic in it. And if that gets buried very rapidly with a bunch of organics, it actually reduces and it releases the arsenic just from its presence in the sediments. And the groundwater doesn't move very fast either. There's lots of organics. And so this is another possible source. And then finally, some people are pointing to phosphates being used on the surface, some of it from human and animal waste and other additions for farming, that leaches down and chemically knocks off the arsenic that's present in the sediments. So it's most likely these causes, but it was actually because you tried to fix another problem, stop people from drinking water where they would get sick because they had waterborne diseases, and give them a clean water source. Well, let's just take one more step. Let's go to some place where there's all kinds of water around. And it's not an issue of the water being present there, it's an issue of kind of a failure of the infrastructure. So let's go to Tajikistan. Now, how many people know where that is? Somebody, the university has asked, has talked to me, said, you need to go to Tajikistan because we have a program starting up over there. And I had to get out my map, figure out where it is. Well, it's right north of Afghanistan. And it's a friendly country to us right now. So it's up in the Himalaya mountains here. So Afghanistan's over here, and Tajikistan is this sort of area in here, and the Himalayas are all over the place. Mountainous country, big rivers flowing along here. And we have a city with a population of about 600,000, the capital city. It has 2 rivers and 2 surface water treatment plants and a bunch of wells to supply water to the city. But we had a typhoid outbreak in the capital city. So why was that? Well, here's what it looked like. These are number of cases, and this is weeks here, and this is in 1996 and 1997. So here we go along here, and all of a sudden clinically diagnosed and culturally confirmed cases of typhoid fever all over the place in town. Why? Well, they ran out of chlorine. That's, their plant got plugged up, and they ran out of chlorine. And so they just kept serving the water, and until an aid agency came in and gave them more chlorine, they couldn't get rid of the problem. So that's the kind of sad story. Now the good story about this is that according to the literature I was reading, that once they saw what was happening, they said, we'd be much better off if we could not use the surface water source and just use the groundwater source to help protect the people. So they started an education program where they went around and tried to explain the problem with typhoid fever and with the surface water, and said, we've got to conserve water, we've got to cut back our use so that we can reduce our consumption so we can go all to groundwater. And in 2000, they were successful enough to do that. And I don't know what's happened since then. So they cut off their surface water supply, went to groundwater, and that basically, for health issues, improves the situation tremendously. So this is kind of the resolution, is switching to groundwater, but they had to do an education program and convince people that this was a smart thing to do. And so they could cut their use so they didn't have to have the surface water. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Well, we said this is, you can paint all this gloom and doom. Of course, there's places where there seems to be plenty of water and everybody's happy. But the UN has basically looked at these issues and its Millennium Development Goals, and it recognized the presence of these 1.1 billion people who don't have access to good water supplies and good sanitation. And so they set goals that by 2015, they wanted to have half the people that were affected here on some safe drinking water supply. And the second goal was they wanted to also have half of that population with basic sanitation access. So they recognized the problem. I was looking at this again today as I was preparing for this talk, and I thought, it's 2006. And they're talking about by 2015, they want to have water supplies, cleaner water supplies for half of 1.1 billion people. That sounds like a pretty tall order today, but hopefully we are moving in this direction. Aha! Is bottled water the answer? Well, there's got to be something good about bottled water, right? Good for what? Good for the Dasani. So here we have a problem. You see, we don't have water, so why don't we just give everybody bottled water? I mean, we could invest heavily in this, right? And we could ship this stuff, and we could supply it, and maybe this is the solution, and we can make sure it's clean, right? And treat it and all that kind of stuff. Don't look too engaged here. I want my water back. Well, let's look at this. Let's look at the issue of bottled water, and some of you coming in already knew the answer and mentioned this to me, right? Is it good for Dasani? $100 billion is spent annually on bottled water. It must be, huh? What's the biggest bottled water producer in the world? Coca-Cola. No, it's actually Nestle's. And they own Perrier. And they own a whole bunch of other water companies. And then it's the Coca-Cola and the others. So they make $100 billion. So certainly it's helping somebody, right? The average price per liter, that was a little more than a quart, a little less than a quart, a little more than a quart, is 75 cents. And that's per gallon, that's $2.83 a gallon. This is all US dollars, right? So I'm just trying to get you thinking about this. And some of you already realize this. What is the value of bottled water? The value is it's a temporary supply, an emergency supply. So certainly, when you see, relief, aid people coming in comes the bottled water. Well, that's good. That's a good use of it, right? And now we take a look at the next thing here. Well, what if you decide to go with bottled water? Well, then everybody's in trouble, because instead of building municipal supplies, you build bottling plants. But the cost of municipal water is so low compared to bottled water that if we invest it all in bottled water for water supplies, the poor people wouldn't be able to buy it. They wouldn't be able to access it. So interestingly enough, the cost of municipal water is often 0.0001 per liter, 1/100th of a cent per liter of water. So when you take that bottle of water that you just took when you came in here, that's not even a liter. You know what? You know how much that cost a liter? That cost 71 cents if it was a whole liter of water for the bottle that you have in your hand, right? 71 cents. If you go out and fill it up in the drinking fountain when we're finished, you actually, in Missoula, you'll spend 0.0018 cents per gallon of water. And you can convert that divided by 4, and you'll be into the cost per liter of water. So the municipal water that we produce here in Missoula is at fractions of a cent per liter, right? And it's good quality water, even though you have to use power to lift it and drill wells and all that. But it's just an unbelievable difference when you look at the price of bottled water. So it doesn't seem to be the solution as far as our getting 1 billion people off of having no water. Certainly bottled water is not the answer. So there's a cost associated with that. This is a busy slide, but there's some interesting things on here. What can we do worldwide with what we have? Okay, so how can we, in situations where we don't have water, we have water scarcity, what kind of actions can be taken? Well, certainly conservation. In agriculture, since it makes up 70% of the world use of water, if we can produce more for using less water, certainly that's a tremendous advantage, and it's someplace you have to look carefully when you're trying to get more water in an area. Urban conservation. Interestingly enough, getting water from one place in town to the other is the biggest loss of water. So you have to produce more water just to get it transmitted across town because of line leaks. So by improving that, you can increase the availability of water. Industrial use of water, talking about China using 23 to 56 cubic meters of water for every ton of steel, where in the US we use 6. So again, it's just an efficiency and the production and reuse of the water. And how else do we control this? Well, we do it by the economic pricing and policies and things. And so part of the issues that they look at, these are from the UN kind of things, is that water policy is also often very fragmented, so it's difficult to manage the water. The government depends too much on centralized administration, where if you put it out in the hands of the communities, you often get better results. Water management policies often don't link the human health and environmental health issues. I mean, we're just talking about water, people drinking water, not the environmental value of the water to the ecological system. And finally, down here, you need to slow population growth. It seems like a theme that we're hearing about all resource use. And also, if we're going to share water and we have water that crosses boundaries, we need to avoid international conflicts, because that stresses that population, cuts off water which is available, which is international water. Well, that's my world view for a moment. Now we want to switch focus briefly to the U.S. and talk about the U.S. in particular and water supplies. And I always put the populations up here because it seems like we keep bringing up this population, how that's going to stress things. Well, here's our population. It's 295 million people in the U.S. here. Okay? Here's the water use in the U.S. starting in the 1950 to 2000. And the dark blue lines are total water use. The light blue is surface water. So we use much more surface water than groundwater. That's the aqua lines down here. And this is the population growth in the U.S. And so that's our water consumption. Now here's your next question. Okay? In the sectors of water use in the United States, what is the largest sector of water use? Agriculture. Any other guesses? Industry. Anything else?
Golf courses.
Golf courses. Wait a minute now. Let's not get political here. Well, you're all wrong. Anybody else got a guess? Bathing. What?
Like cleaning.
Cleaning. Using water for some. Making power. But the good news is we only consume 3% of that water. We use that water, but we're not consuming it, I mean, in the process. But 48% of the water use in the United States is for thermoelectric, for power generation. Coal-fired plants, cooling, all those kinds of issues. Where's the next one? irrigation. On a national basis, 34% of all the water we use is for irrigation. Okay? And then it goes down from there, public supply, 11%, where's the industry, about 5%. We mentioned industry over here. And all the rest of these categories are less than 1%. So kind of interesting. I was amazed when I was reading through this, trying to figure this out, and I thought, what are they talking about? How can that be? But that's the largest water user in the United States. Where do we use that water in the country? The darkest blue are the larger and larger water use in our graph here. So it's where we have a large population, it's dry, and we irrigate. Down here we irrigate and we produce energy in Texas. What do we do in Idaho? Why is Idaho a little darker than Montana? Well, they do a lot of irrigation and it's really dry. So this is the distribution. Mainly it's somewhat population related, somewhat depending on what's going on there. The Dakotas are a lot of farming, not as much irrigating, out there dryland farming, so that's why it looks. But that's the distribution of that water use. Again, of course, as you would expect, not very uniform. So let's go look at just two sort of examples of some water use in the United States, just to illustrate some points. Now you have to notice, I'm leaning a little bit towards the groundwater side of things. That's because I study groundwater, so. But we go to the central part of the country, and we go between, this is North Dakota here, South Dakota, Nebraska. We go down through this into the panhandle of Texas, and we have a large aquifer system here, and this is where 20% of the irrigated land in the United States is located, in the central part of the United States. 30% of the water that is extracted from this deep aquifer, which is called the Ogallala Aquifer, or the High Plains Aquifer, and this is a semi-consolidated to consolidated rock formations which lap up against the Rocky Mountains here, and they dip underneath of this area here, and they're recharged in the Rocky Mountains, and the water flows out underneath of this large land area, and then these are all pivot center irrigation. This is just a block of land to show you what it looks like, the density of that, and they're all run by these turbine pumps. And so in 1930 they invented the turbine pumps so they could drill wells and pump large volumes of water from deep within this rock aquifer. And so everybody started pumping, and the water was pretty shallow and close to the surface, and they could extract large volumes of water to do that. But what started happening, that in parts of the aquifer, these darker colors here, the water table started dropping and started dropping. And it dropped over 100 feet in these darkest areas here. And the consequence was that they were taking water that had been recharged during the last ice age out of the Ogallala Aquifer. And they pumped it so much that as the water levels fell, how do you run a pump, do you think? You have to, electricity, diesel fuel, something. Well, it costs money to run a pump. And the farther you have to lift the water, the more money it costs. Because you need more energy. If you have to lift it from 50 feet, it costs so much. If you have to lift it from 100 feet, it costs even more. And so it got to the point where the cost of pumping started exceeding the profits you could make in farming the crops. And so the consequence of the overuse of the water was that the farmers went out of business because they couldn't produce food anymore because it was too expensive. How about Los Angeles? How many people have been to Los Angeles? Okay, well, that's some of you. All right, where does the water come from in Los Angeles? Owens Valley, Colorado. Well, here's the Los Angeles area. It looks kind of dry, doesn't it? 14% of their supply comes from groundwater. But in this diagram here, the pink area is that the water levels, the water table has dropped below sea level, and that was in 1950. And the consequence of that is that salt water from the ocean has started encroaching inland towards these wells and basically made the water unusable under parts of the coastline. And so they actually have a program where they drill wells and they pump water from their air conditioner coolers into there to try to keep that front from advancing further inland. So they've got a bit of a problem. They're mining their groundwater. They've got salt water moving in. So obviously they need water from other places. And so they have aqueducts. Here's Mono Lake up here, here's Sacramento, and here's the Colorado River. They're the major aqueducts which move water down to the Los Angeles area. Again, here about 760 million cubic meters of water in 2003, 7,000 miles of pipeline to move that water into the Los Angeles area. And the Colorado Aqueduct is one of the major, Colorado River Aqueduct, that's this one up here, it comes across and delivers, is one of the major ones. Now the good news is that the people in Los Angeles, I mean, they use about, on the average, per the public use here, the most of that water is being used for a water supply for the public. They use about 100 gallons per day, 150 gallons a day per person. That's not too bad as far as water use. You probably use 50 to 100 gallons per day for water use, and they live in a much drier and hotter climate. They wash their cars all the time there, I think. But if you think about water management, some good news about how if people in Los Angeles want to grow, population wants to grow, but we want to limit our consumption, or we want to not grow at the same consumptive rate. Well, there's some good news, and some of the literature says that we can improve water use efficiency. And one article we had here says the urban water use, that you can improve it by just off-the-shelf technology, 30 to 40% you can reduce the water use. And if you look at how we use water in an urban setting, and residential indoors is about 32% of the use of the water is inside the house. And then you notice that outdoor watering your plants, 21%. But if we just look at this, we say, well, how can we reduce this use? And they say all you have to do is go to Home Depot or some store like that, Lowe's, in case somebody's here related to that, Ace Hardware, I'm sorry, Ace, go to Ace, and take the current toilet that you have and that's using 32% of the water you're using in your house, and you can make it use only 22% by just replacing the toilet, by putting in a water conservation toilet. And then the other big issue here is line leaks. And that's actually in people's houses. So they say they're losing 12% of the water in the actual houses themselves, and if they fix that, they would drop that down significantly. So it's encouraging that some growth can occur, some water use delivery can stay the same, and you can still serve more people. How about now that was the kind of US thing, and now we're into Montana. See, I'm working my way down here. So how about Montana? Here we are, a population of 903,000. Seems like it should be million, but it's thousand, right? What sector utilizes the most water in Montana? Electricity, I got up here. Yes.
The agriculture of eastern Montana.
The agriculture of eastern Montana. Any other ones? Public supply, mining. You remember you saw that list. You already saw the list, right? Well, of course, it is agriculture, right? It's irrigation. Irrigation is the major water use in Montana. If we look at it, the comparison of also just surface water and groundwater, pretty interestingly, 98% of the water use in Montana is from the streams and lakes and reservoirs. Only 2% from groundwater. What's next? Well, thermoelectric over here, so we were close. And then we get to public supply, and then we drop off in our other aspects. But as you would expect from living here, irrigation is the major water user. Now, in the irrigation, we use about a third of that water that we use for irrigation in sprinkler type of systems, where we have these big center pivots or rollers and that kind of thing. About 2/3 of the water, 1.2 million, what are we in here? 1.2 million something. I'm off of my units here. Oh, Running's laughing at me. Million cubic meters per second day, no, I don't know. But anyway, 2/3 of it is actually from flood irrigation, right, where we're actually just applying it to the land. Now, what are the consequences of doing irrigation on water quality and water supply? And of course, a couple of things happen. Certainly, we pump groundwater out from wells, and we may have some impact, or the aquifers may be renewable. And we have river water that we take. And when we take water from the river, it's interesting because if you look at a hydrograph of a river discharge versus time, these are months January, February. Normally, the river would look like this, coming up and peaking in the spring and dropping back off into the winter. But when we use water for irrigation, it alters the hydrographs of the river, where it comes up and starts to peak, and then we start filling up all the irrigation ditches. So we actually alter the hydrograph of the river, keep it up higher longer, and then slowly let it drop back off again. So there's an effect on the actual river system itself, because we've decided to use the water for that purpose of the river. And then it has the return flows. Sometimes we have consumptive use of the water. We have sediment and salinity and nutrients and agrochemicals which can enter either groundwater or surface water. But we have to remember that Montana, it's a part of our industry, and it's $730 million a year comes out of our agricultural crops. Okay? So we decide to use the water in a certain way, and we have a return on that investment. We get something back from it. Okay? Well, I selected 3 issues to mention briefly about Montana before we take our break. Remember, there's a break coming here. Okay? And so the first one I want to talk about relates to water appropriation, sort of a water rights issue associated with surface water and groundwater, because that's an issue in Montana. And then secondly, I wanted to talk some about mining and water quality issues and focus a little bit on the Clark Fork River. And then lastly, talk about coal bed methane, which is something we hear about in the papers, which seems a long way away unless you're in eastern Montana. And then it's very close at home. Okay, so to begin this discussion, I have another test question for you. How many people are native Montanans here? Oh, see that? That's great. That's great. My kids were born here. I want you to know that's important. That's what Jack Weidenfelder told me when he was. Where is this? I have the Clark Fork, Alberton Gorge, Bitterroot Valley. Nope. Yellowstone. Nope. So what was that way in the back? Smith River. Is it the Smith River? Well, this is the upper Smith River basin. Smith River comes out here and flows through this canyon area here. So I'm going to take you to the Smith River for just a moment. And if we go over to the Smith River here, here's the upper basin in the Smith River system. And the river flows along here and heads down towards eventually goes to the Missouri River. And in 1993, the water rights on what's called the upper Missouri Basin were closed for further appropriation because they said, it seems like we've got over appropriation. Too many people have filed for water rights. We've got to straighten this out and figure out who has what water. Okay? Well, what happened then is that people wanted to use more water in this upper basin. They just filed for groundwater rights. They wanted to drill some large wells for some communities and for some public supplies, for some irrigation water, and use the groundwater instead of using the surface water to be able to grow that area. Okay? Well, the water rights in Montana have changed over time. At one time, the surface water rights and groundwater rights were totally separate. They didn't link together. There was no connection between the two. You got surface water rights, and then you could file for groundwater rights, and they were totally separate. And then, well, within my time here, in the last 25 years, well, the definition started changing. Like, well, if the groundwater is kind of flowing and connected to the surface water, well, then maybe it's kind of like a surface water right. Now the conflict starts. Well, now are you pumping groundwater or surface water? Whose rights are you stepping on if you're trying to develop some groundwater? And then to try to get around, to try to address that, in one of the last legislative sessions, they passed something called, well, if groundwater, so here's a little diagram that we'll imagine. Here's a river, and there's groundwater flowing to both sides, discharging to the river, and nearby here we put in a well, we turn the well on, start pumping out water to irrigate our field, and we actually start to draw water from the river to the well. So water's flowing to the well because we're pumping water out of the well. Well, according to the new law, that's called directly and immediately connected. And you can't do that. Okay? You can't file for a right of that as a separate groundwater right because what you're really doing is you're interfering with the surface water. Okay? With those who have rights on the surface water. So this is what's been happening in the Smith Valley and upper Smith River Basin. And the very interesting thing is that when the Smith River was running through here, in the last 3 or 4 years, we've had droughts and all kinds of things going on. So the water levels have been dropping and dropping in the river. And then people were drilling wells and starting to pump the wells. Well, an interesting coalition got together to try to limit the amount of groundwater extraction in that basin. And it consisted of some odd bedfellows. Trout Unlimited, the Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. Well, that kind of makes sense. But then the power company that produces hydropower on the Missouri River joined. And then the senior water right holders for the surface water Down below the canyon, the ranchers who had been doing that since the 1800s, they had senior water rights to everyone else. They joined in and said, hey, wait a minute. You're taking the water that's supposed to flow down that river that I have first rights to use, and you're capturing it using those groundwater. You can't do that. So this coalition kind of got together and said, well, no, something's not right about this. And so where we are now is that there's been various lawsuits and discussions, but what it's done is it's basically sort of raised the issue of we need some new legislation to actually address this issue. And so that's what's happening in the Smith River Basin. Well, let's just take a moment and look at the Clark Fork here, get closer to home. Clark Fork River, as we know, starts up at Butte, Berkeley Pit, Silverbow Creek, which has had mining impacted tailings spread over the floodplain. We head down into the Deer Lodge Valley where the Anaconda smelter is. There's over 40 square miles of lands which are impacted by mining waste and smelting waste in this area. We move down the river and we get to Milltown, and then we get to Missoula. Now, of course, we need to realize that this extraction of ore up here in the Butte area and the smelting in the Anaconda, they played a large economic role in Montana from the late 1800s till about 1980. So what did we get out of that? Well, you have copper pipes in this building and wiring and everything else. So obviously, you know, from that extraction things were generated. But there was also an environmental consequence of that. And interestingly enough, this is a plot from my colleague Johnny Moore that I always thought was kind of interesting. And this is a plot of the dissolved arsenic concentration, you know, stuff in the water, it's dissolved in the water, in the Clark Fork River, right as you see Silverbow Creek comes out of the mined areas and is contaminated, and it has a concentration of about 15, and it goes into Warm Springs Ponds. Warm Springs Ponds are these 3 ponds that were built there to basically catch the contaminated water. They lime it, let it sit there, and then water flows out the other end. And where are my trout fishermen? There's these big trout right below the spillway that are hanging out down there in that part of the river. Interestingly enough, when it comes out of Warm Springs Ponds, the concentration of arsenic is almost doubled. Dissolved arsenic. And then it flows down the Clark Fork River, and it's diluted by all the tributaries that come in, and so you get this nice little logarithmic change till you get all the way down to Milltown. So there's dissolved arsenic in the Clark Fork River to start with just because of the mining operations upstream. So you should keep that in mind. I mean, that's part of the impact, and we're going to talk a little more about the arsenic aspects of that. And it's not that we don't have another economic development going on. Okay? The cleanup related to these mining is $500 million have been spent up in the upper basin area, and $390 million is projected to be recovered by the state of Montana for resource damage in the upper basin. So there's another whole economic issue associated with this. But let's go down to Milltown for just a minute, because I was told tonight that I had to say something about Milltown, so here. Okay, so we need to talk a little bit about Milltown. What's going on? Let's just, for those of you who aren't totally familiar with it, we'll just briefly review. Here's the Milltown Reservoir here with the Milltown Dam. The Blackfoot River, of course, comes in. Here's Missoula. Clark Fork River flows down here through East Missoula and then through Hellgate Canyon and out here to Missoula. We remember that the dam was built in between sort of 1906 and 1907. Was closed, and there was this 100-year flood, a gigantic flood. They blew the dam up to try to pass water through the dam. It overtopped the powerhouse. They rebuilt it in 1908 and shut the gates, and it's been that way ever since. But what's happened is that sediments coming downstream started collecting behind the dam, and this used to be all open pool in here. So all this vegetated area are sediments which have piled up here and now vegetated. The dam's about 30 feet high, so that gives you an idea that we have a package of sediments in there. And these sediments, unfortunately, have some mining wastes in them, and as a result of that, we now know that there's arsenic and iron and manganese that are moving out into the groundwater and contaminating these wells in the town of Milltown. So in 1981, when I first got here, these 4 wells were discovered to have arsenic concentrations that exceeded the 50 parts per billion standard. Remember in Bangladesh, that was 37 million people, and now the standard is 10, so that's been lowered. But in that 1981, it was 50. And these things were between 80 and 500 parts per billion, so they were exceeding it quite a bit. For 25 years, there's been investigations and legal actions and plans and everything else, but now there's been an agreement signed, and the plan is that starting this year, work is going to begin to remove this package of sediments right in here, and they're actually going to remove the dam and change the whole river system and restore it and spend between $70 and $100 million 5 miles outside of Missoula here. Well, what's the issue? Well, the issue is that these sediments, here's the dam, and this package of sediments here, it has a whole bunch of metals from the mining industry locked in those sediments, tons of arsenic and zinc and copper and things that came down. And and as a result of that, this is the dam is right here, and there's this plume in groundwater that's contaminated these 4 wells and a few other ones, and it's moving down sort of, I call it the interstate plume because it kind of follows the interstate down there, and it's got concentrations of dissolved arsenic in it. And it's fortunately not gone very far. This is about 300 meters, so it's only gone about 300 or 400 meters. That's encouraging. But the plan is to remove this chunk of contaminated sediments, which is this part of the sediments right in here, and because mainly they think the main source of the plume is coming from these very contaminated sediments here. And then that's going to be the restoration. We're going to do that, and then we're going to make the river look like this. So here's an artist's conception. When everything is said and done, here's the interstate bridge on the Blackfoot. Here's what they hope it will look like. A river will be flowing through here and connecting, and we'll have the river restored. And we're working on, I mean, not we, but people are working on plans, the state of Montana, on restoration of the river, changing the channel, and making it a river. Well, why would they want to take this dam out? Well, they have groundwater contamination. The real driving economic force is to clean up the groundwater. But they also have fish passage issues because the dam blocks bull trout and endangered species from moving upstream. They have other fish issues in the reservoir. They have pike in the reservoir clean itself up. But the groundwater flow in this area is heading towards Missoula. The good news is when you measure wells out here, you don't find arsenic contamination in the groundwater, so that's good news. But the Clark Fork River flows along here, and it goes through Hellgate Canyon and comes out into the valley. And the Clark Fork River is kind of unusual because along most of its reach here, it basically is perched above the groundwater system. Pretty unusual. And it's leaking water from its bed into the underlying sands and gravels and clays. And so as it comes through Hellgate Canyon, it's losing water through its bed into the Missoula Aquifer that we have right here underneath our feet. So there's water flowing laterally, we call it underflow, coming out of the canyon and into the valley, into the aquifer. And then there's water leaking from the river, which is also helping recharge the aquifer. So if we look at this sort of diagram of groundwater flow, here's Hellgate Canyon. These little blue lines are contour lines on the groundwater system, and they go from high elevation to low elevation. And so the groundwater flows along here out of Hellgate Canyon. And south of the river, it turns and heads over towards the Bitterroot. And then Rattlesnake Creek comes down, and it loses water out of its bed, and there's water coming out of the canyon, and it comes in, and it pushes some water during some of the year, maybe across underneath the river, but most of the water stays on the north side of the river and actually kind of parallels the river. This is mostly Rattlesnake Creek water. And if you look right here in the canyon, you'd find that you'd have the river sitting here and then some gravel, and then you'd have the underflow of the groundwater coming through Hellgate Canyon. And if you got down here at Madison Street Bridge area, you'd find a thicker package of sediments there and the river perched up higher above the aquifer. Now the red dots are 4 Mountain Water Company production wells that supply a large portion of our water. There are 36 total wells. These are just 4 that we looked at examples. And I had 2 students trying to figure out, well, where does the water really come from that's pumped out of these wells? What percentage is coming from where? Interestingly enough, the leakage from the Clark Fork River makes up over 80% of the recharge, the water that's replenished annually into the Missoula Aquifer. Well, this is, okay, we're looking at the sources of water for these 4 production wells. We did all kinds of studies, and we actually did some numerical simulations that would track, these are tracks of water particles, which show that underflow from Hellgate Canyon comes along like this, and it comes out, and this big production well out here is mostly gathering its water from Hellgate Canyon underflow. But the wells closer to the river are getting water that's leaking down through the bottom of the river and collecting that water. And this one well on the north side of the river here, it's over by the New Millennium Building, It's actually getting almost all of its water from Rattlesnake Creek, from recharge from Rattlesnake Creek. Very different chemistry, very different looking water. And so we can figure that out and figure out sort of travel times. And so, for example, this well 34, when it's pumping, the way it's constructed, it gets about 18% of its water from underflow in Hellgate Canyon, and it gets 82% of its water from the leakage dropping down through the bottom of the river. So it's pretty significant. It's pretty directly connected to the river as far as the main water coming out of that well. Now, during the dam removal, this is a table, and I'll just read you this one line here. It says temporary construction-related water quality standards. So in order to do the project at Milltown, the issue is we're going to have some impact on the river. We recognize that because this is a big construction project. So we're going to allow certain things to happen, but we can't go out of those boundaries. And it says here that we can have two things happen. We can have the concentration of the river go to 340 parts per billion. The standard is 10 for drinking water for 24 hours, or excuse me, for 1 hour. Okay? For very short duration. Some event happens, that's allowed to happen. Or we can have it get an average value of 10, which is the drinking water standard, for up to a 30-day average. So we could have the water chemistry bounce around, but we could have sections of it coming through. So the concern, of course, is that we don't want that to happen. We want to keep the water chemistry good in the river so that we're not impacting the water coming out of these production wells. And we can kind of predict what those concentrations might be because we figured out how to mix those waters up, because we now know how water actually comes and is contributed to each one of these wells that are near the river. That's some research that we've been doing recently. Okay, last part before our rest, and that's cold bed methane. How many, familiar with that? Issues in the paper all over the place. When Gene and I first came to Montana, we started out in eastern Montana. We lived in Lame Deer for 3 years, and we worked on coal issues. And at that time, in 1970s, it was coal, open pit coal mining and impacts on water resources. Well, here we are, 30 years later. And now we have another issue, and we're back out in eastern Montana again. And out in eastern Montana, in the Powder River Basin. So here's Montana. This area here. It's in Wyoming and in Montana. Here's the Bighorn Mountains, kind of right in here. So here's this area called the Powder River Basin. There's 22.4 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, which they call methane gas, in that coal seams that are out there. Now, the actual annual use of gas in the United States is 21 trillion cubic feet. So 21 trillion cubic feet is 1 year's supply of natural gas for the whole country at the current use that we're doing. And that's available in the Powder River Basin. Just keep that number in mind for a minute. Well, what's going on in Montana? Well, if we go up here and look at the border, we're over here where we have the Tongue River and the Powder River and the Yellowstone River up here, Miles City, that area. And so this area is where they're going to do the development because that's where the coal is. Well, how do they do this? There's not as much available. You see there's only 2.5 trillion cubic feet predicted to be recoverable in here. Well, that sounds good. How are they going to do this? Well, what they do is that you have to, the coal seams are actually the aquifers. So the coal seams are fractured, and they have water moving through them, and the gas is basically sorbed onto the coal, the surface of the coal. But the problem is with the water pressure in the coal seams, the gas won't release. So they have to pump down the water pressure in the coal seams, extract water, lower the water level in the coal seam until it gets low enough that the gas will come off of the coal seams, and then they can collect the gas. So when they produce the coal bed methane, they also produce water with that. And that's this process here. They lower the water table. The red dots are the gas. They pipe that off, but they also have to pipe off the water in the system. So they can do that with multiple wells and coal seams, taking the original water levels, dropping them down, and collecting the gas. Well, if we go to that Montana area again, here's the Yellowstone River up here. Here's this area. What kind of development's going to happen? Well, right now we have about 500 wells in this particular area, and they've produced about 40 million cubic feet of gas, and they've produced 566,000 cubic feet of water along with that. Okay? What is the predicted kind of well density that there might be out here? Well, this very dark thing is 5,650 wells will be drilled in this area. And then we go to the next color, 5,400 wells. There's a whole lot of wells to get this gas out of here, right? So if we go to Wyoming, well, first we make a note here that the BLM, under the current energy policy, has approved on BLM lands 77,000 wells for Montana and Wyoming. So to get permits, to allow permits for drilling wells. And what they do in Wyoming, this is a Wyoming gas field, this is 1 square mile. They put 5 wells in this as kind of an X pattern, and then they have to connect all these wells together and have power and have compressors to basically compress the gas and store the gas. And they have to build then drilling platforms and infrastructure, road structure, and then they have to do something with the water. So then they pump the water out and they put it in these little ponds all over the place, or they do something else with it. But they have now this water that they have to deal with. And that's part of the impact issues. In Wyoming right now, there's 14,000 wells, okay, in their developed area. And I didn't know how this was going to show up. This is a 10-mile swatch of Wyoming. This is the Montana border. The Bighorn Mountains are right here. This is the Tongue River heading over the Montana border. And this is in 1999. And this is in 2003. And I don't know whether you can see this, but there's all kinds of little blue things all over the place. And those are all holding ponds for the produced water, which weren't there in 1999. And so the issue really is the groundwater disposal, this water they're pumping up. And why is that an issue? Well, because it typically has fairly high salinity and high sodium contents. So if you put it on soils, you have reaction with the soils and plant growth. Some of it can be irrigated. Some of it's pretty good quality. So you can re-inject it. That's more costly to do. It's hard to get it in the ground because the coal seams don't accept it very easily. You let it evaporate or put it in seepage ponds. You discharge it to rivers. You treat and discharge it, or you land apply it. But this is what I found most interesting. The life of one of these well fields is only 7 to 10 years. So we're going to do all of this, and we're going to operate for 7 to 10 years, and then we're out of gas, right? We're done as far as the amount of disturbance that's happening on the system. Okay, so I'm basically finished now, for the first part anyway. So if you want to stay for the second part, I really hope you will. But let's remember, we talked about the kind of world water budget and water budget components and the world water supplies, and looked at the US and looked at some Montana issues. And there's a couple of issues here you might take home. Here's the water use in the world. Kind of, here we are 2000. I mean, you might project that line. Here we go. Uh-oh. We're off in outer space here. And remember what's happening. Industrializing nations need more and more water, so the industrial part of this is growing as well as we need food. Well, look at what we've done in the US. This is kind of encouraging. Look at the water use in the US. This is the water use in the US. It came up and peaked here in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and then it's basically leveled off. So we're still growing economically. We're still doing things, but it's the whole price of water and conservation issues and how expensive it is environmentally to contaminate things, so people are reusing and retreating that water in the industry. So we have this kind of response, and that's kind of encouraging. I don't know how long it's going to last, but it's something to keep in mind. If we could get the world water supply, water demand to start doing that, that would be encouraging, but this doesn't look very promising. So how are we going to try to worry about the world conservation issues? Water reuse we really didn't talk about very much in this first part, but certainly the issue of treated wastewater, sewage, industrial waste being reused in the process. But the real issues still relate to that, worldwide distribution. I mean, we got a lot of renewable resource, except it's in the wrong places. And so part of our issue here is the distribution and poverty, and then the other ecological issues. Okay? Chinese proverb to kind of finish things off here, that if we don't change course, we might end up where we're going. And so I'll leave that to you for food for thought. And what I want to do now is I want to take an intermission. So I want to give you, holy smokes, I want to give you 5 minutes to get up and stretch and get some water. And then we'll just have a brief discussion on another subject, if you're interested in that. And then we'll have some questions and stuff. Okay, let's get started again. See, this is dangerous because, this thing shouldn't be scheduled for, an hour and a half, right? Because you don't want to sit here all this long time. But you didn't schedule it like that. So, if you're going to get some credits, you got to 2-hour class, you get like 4 credits if that meets a couple of times a week. Oh, I'm sorry, I was on the wrong thing. Well, let's get on to a different subject in a sense, but it relates to water. And I was sitting here the other week listening to one of the lectures, and I kept looking around the room, and I see a bunch of physicians and folks in the medical in the healthcare industry and various interests. And so I thought, well, I'll have an opportunity to talk about this. Maybe this will be interesting to some of you, but I think it'll hopefully be interesting to everyone. And what I want to talk about today is some what we call emerging issues, and they are finding the presence of trace amounts of pharmaceuticals in the environment. But what I'm going to address this evening, is just a brief look at pharmaceuticals and their issues associated with groundwater. So we're going to do that by talking about the source of the pharmaceuticals, and then the occurrence in septic systems, and then what in the world, so what? It's kind of like, well, what does this mean? If there's something there, is that important or not? And so I guess that, what we're talking about are things that you would see in the paper like this: Prozac and painkillers found in tap water. It's in the Vancouver Sun. And what are we talking about, these pharmaceutically active compounds? Well, things like the antibiotics and hormones and prescription and non-prescription drugs. So we're talking about the kind of things that we would take or consume out there in the system. So I have to ask you this question, though, because it's getting late and we have audience participation here. Okay, what are the possible avenues that would deliver pharmaceuticals to groundwater systems or surface water systems? So give me some examples. There's obviously human waste. Okay, there's one. What else? Industry, manufacturing kind of thing? Okay, so we have manufacturing and we have human waste. What else have we got? This guy's the only one who wants to raise his hand over here. So.
Agriculture, wanting to, livestock being fed animals.
So, use in the agricultural side of things is another possible source. What else?
Dumping old drugs down the toilet.
Dumping disposal issues, right? Waste, getting rid of them somehow. Okay. Well, here's some examples of how you get these pharmaceuticals into water systems or into the environment. Okay. The first one, of course, is human and animal fecal matter. We use them, they come out of our system. Sometimes they're used up, often they're changed, or they come out the same way they went in because we didn't use all of them. And so we have that waste then gets into wastewater treatment plants, and they discharge things into rivers, often to get rid of that effluent. We have septic systems, on-site disposal. Here's the agricultural animal production units. These are chickens, all these white-looking things here, and here's waste coming out of this giant, 200,000 chickens in one place. And then we have biosolids, the disposal either by land or something of things that come out of sewage treatment plants, for example. And then we have the drug disposal issues, and they get put in landfills, or they get flushed down the toilet, or they get flushed into your septic system, right, when you try to get rid of them. And then we have direct application. Did we say that? Oh, well, like if you have a fish farm, you keep your fish healthy, you give them a bunch of drugs. And so you directly apply it to the water. Interestingly enough, we actually use them for spraying fruit trees and sometimes for pest control. So let's look at one group of those, the antibiotics, is just how much of that stuff is out there and do we actually use. In the U.S., about 15,000 tons of antibiotics are used by humans each year. That's about 60% of the use. Agriculture, about 10,000 tons of use. So that's the other big user here. And earlier I found data where agricultural use actually exceeded the human use. And here aquaculture, that's our fish farms here, 20 to 200 tons of 200 tons are used in that as direct application. And then I thought this was fascinating. We actually use tetracycline and streptomycin to be sprayed on fruit trees to kill certain microbial diseases. So we directly apply it to the tree. I thought that was interesting. I didn't know that. I just thought that was interesting. And then I found another kind of interesting piece of information about use, and that is that in Hawaii, they've got this infestation of these frogs, and they spray 100 to 200 pounds per acre of caffeine on the landscape to try to kill these frogs. So they directly apply it to the land here. Interesting. Okay. How about the occurrence in septic systems? Well, what I'm talking about is some research that we've been doing over the years on looking at kind of pharmaceuticals and looking at viruses and other things moving around in the groundwater. We had funding from a number of different sources. My graduate student Emily Godfrey is the main work person here and the scientist who did a lot of this work. I acknowledge her. We had help from laboratories in Long Island, and Garen Smith also served on Emily's committee. So the questions we're going to ask are these kind of 3 questions. Number 1, if we put drugs in a tank, do they get out the other end? If we get things in a septic tank, do they ever get out of a septic tank? And what are the factors that control the transport? And then finally, to what concentrations might users be exposed by consuming water out there? So what kind of concentrations are we talking about here? And if we remember septic tank, how many people in here have homes with septic tanks? Okay, rural, have you, how many, and keep one hand up. How about domestic well, go along with the septic tank? Okay, well that's pretty typical for this audience, for Montana here, for living out in the country. And you know, the way a septic tank works is that all of the wastes in your house go out in a pipe, they go into a tank that's about 1,000 gallons or 1,500 gallons. The solids settle out and separate, about a 24-hour holding time, and then the effluent comes out into a perforated field of pipes and is allowed to percolate then into the groundwater system. So the treatment is first a settling primary treatment, and then the effluent actually percolates through the soils and has some additional treatment and then enters the groundwater, and as it moves along in the groundwater, we can have some additional treatment, hopefully. How do we protect ourselves from exposure to these kinds of things? Well, we have what we call setback distances. So from this drain field area where you are disposing of the liquid, your well is supposed to be at least 30 meters or 100 feet away. So that's the setback distance, to try to keep your well away from the drain field. But there's another separation distance, and in Montana, below the drain field, the bottom of the drain field and the highest groundwater position, the highest water table position, you have to have at least a 4-foot separation, or 1.2 meters. So that's the other thing. So we've got some soil underneath of the drain field, and we have some separation between your water supply and the actual location of your drain field. So I'm going to take you to Frenchtown High School, okay, where we've done a bunch of research, and we're actually going to look and see what's going on with some pharmaceuticals in that particular system, and we'll compare that to some actual individual or single family kind of places. So we'll take you to the high school here, and this is a high school, of course, as you know, in a rural area, and out in front of it here is where its septic tank and drain field is located, because it's a rural high school. It's not on a city sewer system, right? So here we have Frenchtown, about 350 students and staff. This is the actual location. Here's the tank, and then this area here is the drain field. You can kind of see the difference in vegetation as you have the lines are lined up like this here. This is the plume of impacted groundwater, high nitrate concentrations, that the groundwater is flowing in this direction. It's carrying the effluent in the groundwater down gradient, heading to the south towards the Clark Fork. Geologically, we have about 3 meters of sand, and then we have the water table, and then we have sand and gravel, which goes down about 30 feet, and that's the shallow aquifer in that particular area. Most domestic wells are finished through a second aquifer, which is down about 100 feet, so that's good in this particular area. So what we're going to do is look at the concentration of some selected pharmaceuticals in the tank in a well finished right below the drain field, sampling that shallow groundwater right under the drain field, and then as the groundwater moves away from that, to sample the actual chemistry as we move further along. These are the compounds that we were looking for, and when you hear people today talk about pharmaceutical studies and impacts to water, you usually hear them talk about all kinds of different drugs and compounds, and you hear some people talk about estrogens and endocrine disruptors and hormones and all kinds of. Well, part of our challenge is our ability to analyze for certain compounds, what equipment we have, and we're now going to look in the parts per trillion range, very, very small quantities to detect some of these things. And so we were limited in the ability that we had to look for certain drugs, so we could only look for this group of compounds. You may recognize some names in here, but we looked for these 22. And we also, the literature told us that these are often found in water. So we have evidence that they do occur in water, so that was part of our selection process. Well, what did we find? We found 6 prescription drugs in measurable quantities and 6 non-prescription drugs in the septic tank effluent. Okay? So we found carbamazepine Carbamazepine on the label is an anticonvulsant drug used to treat seizure kind of things, but we'll have the physicians tell us that it's also used off-label for a number of other purposes, which it's quite effective for. We had sulfamethoxyl, an antibiotic, trimethoprim, another antibiotic, warfarin. Warfarin is used for those of us with heart issues to thin your blood, right? Keep your blood thin. Where else is it used? Rat poison. I don't think we have too many rats, though, in Frenchtown, so I don't know. I wouldn't expect that to be a source. Codeine from cough syrup, and erythromycin, an antibiotic metabolite. So those are the prescription drugs that we detected of the few that we looked for. We looked for 22, right? We found 6 prescription, and we found 6 non-prescription drugs. Okay, we found some Tylenol, some caffeine, a metabolite of caffeine, nicotine, metabolite of nicotine, and then we found some Zantac, which is for stomach upset, right? It's for acid reflux kind of treatment. So we found that as measurable quantities in the effluent. Okay, well, what kind of concentrations did we find? We sampled on 2 different dates, the septic tank effluent about a week apart. And the concentrations were about the same, so it wasn't like we just got a mysterious hit of one of them or the other one. This line represents, below this line is parts per trillion, and above this line is parts per billion. So these are very low concentrations, but they're measurable and detectable. And so this just gives you an idea that they varied, but they were similar on the same dates. Now, how does this compare? What are you saying? You're saying, well, they sampled this septic tank at the high school. Of course. How does that compare with somebody's individual septic tank? Well, we did another study where we sampled 32 septic tanks, and we analyzed for the same 22 compounds. And these orange bars on the diagram are the median concentrations that we found of those compounds in the individual septic tanks. So it shows you that the high school was pretty much like the high school tank was similar in concentrations to the levels that we found in individual tanks. So it's probably fairly representative of what will happen if something's in an individual tank and not just the representative of the high school tank itself. Okay, so now we go to the drain line. Here comes the effluent out of the tank, and now it percolates through 2 meters of sand and hits the water table. And then we put a well in and sampled the chemistry of the water right here. Well, there's some good news. Here's the 12 compounds we started with, and in that group of 12 compounds, after only going through 2 meters of sand before it got to the water table, percolating down through the soil, we only found 3 of those compounds in measurable concentrations in the groundwater. Carbamazepine, that was that anticonvulsant drug. Sulfamethoxyl, that's an antibiotic, right, sulfa drug. And then we found a little nicotine, and the nicotine was actually out away from the actual area where we sampled. We found that later. But the good news is that we lost 75% of the compounds, didn't make it through that, so something happened. They degraded, they absorbed, they basically were taken below their detection limit, which was still very low. So that's good news, that we're having some treatment take place. But the carbamazepine, you notice here, it started out in the effluent at these concentrations, about 400, and in the groundwater it was in these concentrations, so it only dropped by 2 to 5 times in concentration as it moved through the soil. And then over here, the sulfamethoxyl was in higher concentrations, and it basically was taken out and changed much more dramatically. So there's obviously other geochemical processes going on. So now we take a look at that same well, and we now sample wells as we move down the groundwater flow line. Now we have impacted the groundwater. Now we're moving the groundwater in this direction, and we have a series of wells, and we sampled them on 2 different dates. That's just, these represent that week apart sampling times. And the blue line here is the carbamazepine concentration in that well we just looked at, right under the drain field. And this is in meters as we go away from, down gradient from the drain field here. So this is getting out to 15 meters away or 30 feet away, and we still have measurable concentrations of the compounds. And the yellow is the sulfamethoxyl, and here's that nicotine, one nicotine hit out here. And no, my student wasn't a smoker, so we don't think it wasn't some cross-contamination issue. And then we sampled it the next about a week later, and again, you see these concentrations. What's interesting is that they're not dropping off and rapidly declining as they're being transported through the groundwater, so they're quite persistent as far as still being present in the system. Well, why these 2 drugs? And fortunately, Dr. Smith is here tonight, and all the rest of you organic chemists in the room. Because you look at the structure of those compounds and you say, oh, look at those funny rings, and they're basically how they're charged, and so they don't like to sorb or attach or break down or fall apart. They're pretty sturdy compounds, and these various environments. And the literature keeps finding carbamazepine from other studies, which is very, very interesting, and sulfomethoxyl often in contaminated water. Well, the first thought was maybe we prescribe a whole bunch of that stuff in Missoula. Right? So we went to one of the pharmacies and we said, we got some information, all blinded about how we got that information, but they said, we'll tell you what the prescription rate is over a 4-week period on the mass of these compounds, these series of compounds that you found here, just how much we've been prescribing to give you an idea whether there's large dosages going out in the environment or small. And for those 22 compounds, interestingly enough, the second and third most mass that was put out by this pharmacy was actually those 2 compounds. So, you think, well, then if we look in the septic tank, we're going to find high concentrations of those things in the septic tank, right? Because we've got a bunch of it out there being used by people and so on and so forth. But when you look at the data, you don't really see that, because here's in the individual tanks and in the thing. I mean, this is again parts per trillion range, and we're only finding it in the part 10 or 1 to 10. I mean, these things aren't gigantic. We have a little higher sulfomethoxyl, but still, it's not like that they're just way above everything else, and that's why they're present in the system. So the chemistry of the compounds and their resistance to being broken down and changing once they enter the environment is something that is most likely controlling most of what's happening. And as I said, other researchers are finding these same compounds time and time again. Whenever I ask a colleague who starts working on this, I said, well, gee, did you sample for carbamazepine? And they say, well, yeah. And I said, well, did you find it? They said, yeah. And it's like, well, why in the world is that showing up out there? But it's very persistent once it gets into the system. Oh, this is my animation. I wake you all up here. But, that's because I couldn't turn it off again. So another thing that we did is I talked to the City County Health Department. I said, well, let's go out in the Missoula Valley and just one time, screening level, let's sample a bunch of the monitoring wells that the Water Quality District samples out there. And let's do it in mostly unsewered areas of Missoula. And if you remember, in Missoula, this is Reserve Street. And so the area, as you know, west of Reserve Street here is all on septic systems and wells mostly, and this is mostly sewered in here, and then we have the Rattlesnake, which is partially sewered and things. And so we sampled those wells for the same 22 compounds. And we found in those wells cotinine, trimethoprim, that's an antibiotic, carbamazepine, caffeine, and in measurable concentrations. So we have trace amounts, and these are wells that penetrate the water table, not the deeper part of the system, but just right near the water table. And I think that there's another animation where they drew circles around carbamazepine. See that? Isn't that neat? Huh? But interesting, huh? So then, now the good news is we sampled, somebody's tap here that gets mountain water water, and we were below the detection limits. We couldn't find anything in there of any of those compounds. Now remember, we only sampled for 22 compounds. I have no idea what other things might be out in the system because we didn't look for them at this point. Okay, last part. So what? Okay, so hot diggity, you found something. Is there some issue here? Well, this is what a septic system plume looks like. Okay, so here's the drain field, and this is contaminated groundwater up in Ontario. And it's interesting because the plume is quite long. It's probably over 160 meters long, and it's about 7 or 8 meters wide. So it's kind of long and narrow, and it stretches out. So that's impacted groundwater. So we have these setback distances, right? So we're supposed to be 100 feet away from the drain field. So Steve Running said, this is where my well is. This is where I want my well. Setback distance sounds like a great idea because the groundwater is flowing in this direction, and here's my well back over here. But it doesn't mean that somebody else can't have their well here because that's still 30 meters away or 100 feet away. It just happens to be in the middle of the plume. And that's not so good, right? So that's the real exposure or risk, is that, being in the bad place, right? And so now you're pumping out the water in that system. And what did we learn? Well, we learned from our study here that you have a drain field and it's septic effluent, and it has concentrations in these pharmaceuticals of 10 to a million parts per trillion, depending on which compound it is. But the good news is that when it goes through the soil zone, we lose most of it. But we still have this persistence at very low concentrations. And then we can transport it, and we still have this persistence. It doesn't go away when we start moving it through the system. Oh yeah, I forgot to tell you about one thing. What if you have more than one septic tank in an area? So this is a study. Oh, no, I didn't. Oh, shucks. I was just the right timing. No, that's the next statement. This is the number of studies that have been done on groundwater and pharmaceuticals. And there's not been very many. And this is the transport distances. This is the 30-meter or the 100-foot setback line. So this is the work we did at Frenchtown High School. This was some work in Nebraska. And this is work in Germany. And it shows transport in sand and gravel aquifers over very long distances. And the reason that they did the work in Germany was because the Berlin water supply had pharmaceuticals in it. Because they let all their sewage go into one of the lakes. Then they drilled wells about 100 to 200 meters away from the lake in the aquifer and pumped them very hard to draw the lake water, to take the pathogens out of it into their wells. And when it came back up and they analyzed it, they found trace pharmaceuticals in the drinking water supply. And so they have doing work for the past 10 years worrying about this pharmaceutical issue. This is the thing where I was saying I forgot to tell you. And the issue here is, what if you have more than one septic tank? You know, we talk about the exposure from one tank. Well, this is Lolo, and here's Lolo Creek coming down to the Bitterroot River, right? And so now we're just going to flip this around. So north is now up to the top. So here's the Bitterroot River, here's Lolo Creek, and all these red dots are septic systems. And we did a study out there looking at nitrate issues, and what we did is model that. And so we generated what we actually observed for nitrate, and that's what these maps are. The brighter and brighter colors are higher and higher concentrations of the nitrate as multiple plumes sort of coalesce. And so the issue is, well, what about pharmaceuticals in an area where you have multiple plumes? Could you get higher concentrations because you have multiple sources? So that's something to keep in the back of your mind. Okay, well, what are we doing about regulating this? You know, what about the regulation? Well, there aren't any. No regulations in water, right? We don't have any regulations. Now, why don't we have any regulations? Well, because people have just started finding this stuff. We're back in the Superfund days when people started finding these organics that we never really analyzed for. We're in the same way with the pharmaceuticals. So EPA is right now doing two things. First is trying to figure out how to analyze for these in a consistent manner. So they're still developing the analytical tools to be consistent. Secondly, they're trying to figure out, once they can get a number that they believe, now what's the risk involved with exposure to that? So that's being developed, but it's not out there. There are no regulations on pharmaceuticals at this point in the system. How about there's another player that might get involved? The people who regulate the drugs. Part of their criteria say that if the drug will occur in the environment in less than 1 part per billion, then we don't have to do a bunch of other studies about how it might impact things. But if it occurs at higher than that, we do. Well, some of these compounds may occur at higher than that, and it may trigger some additional work by the Food and Drug Administration on top of the EPA and other folks. And then the Germans down here, they've been working on this for a little bit longer, and they're trying to, they've set some preliminary standards. They suggest limits, as concentrations, but nobody really still knows what this means as far as the risk. Okay. Now my physicians in the room and others, pharmacists and other people, I now have 12 parts per trillion carbamazepine in the water that I now start to consume. I'm now drinking water with 12 parts per million carbamazepine. That bottled water doesn't look so bad now, does it? How much do I have to drink? How much do I have to drink to get a therapeutic dose? 80 million gallons with somebody in the back room. I mean, isn't that that's the first part of the issue. I mean, am I going to get a therapeutic dose of this? Well, let's put things in perspective. The answer to that is 41 millions of liters of water a day. Okay, so, what's the issue, right? So in other words, what we're finding are very small quantities, but it means to get a therapeutic dose, we'd have to consume gigantic amounts because it's such a small concentration. Now, I can't tell you what that means if it's done for long periods of time or there's multiple compounds. I mean, we have no idea. But there's two other issues that come into play here. The second one here relates to the exposure of non-target species in the environment to these low levels of compounds. And you know where that comes from. That comes from the feminization of fish below sewage treatment plants. I mean, that's how people sort of got excited. They said, look, we noticed all these fish in the effluent stream coming out of sewage treatment plants are all female or have some female-like features. And they attributed that to the estrogen that was making it through the sewage treatment plants from things like birth control pills. So they said, oh, whoa, this is not good. You know, estrogen is, if that's what the cause of this is. So these low levels, I mean, exposing other things like bacteria or frogs or fish or macroinvertebrates to these low levels, again, what is the consequence? There might be some environmental issues associated with that. I don't know what the issue is and how it affects the food chain. And then the last one, and I think that that's probably the, you know, maybe become important. I mean, maybe the real key for a while until we figure it out. And that's at these low levels that are out there in the environment, are we getting antibiotic resistance of microbes that then we're somehow going to become exposed to, and we're going to not be able to treat that kind of issue. And so that's the other thing. And that may be the sort of hook that keeps work going for a while to figure out, is that going to ever happen, or is that important in the system? So there are other issues than just the actual exposure. Now the last couple of points are just here, relate to, well, could we cut the source down? You know, I mean, that might be some way to help minimize getting it out in the environment. And of course, this is the consumption of drugs in 1988 to 94, and the consumption by all ages in 99 to 2000. And the blue is they take at least 1 to 2 prescription drugs, and this group takes 3 or more. And all you see is these are longer each time for each age classification. Here we get out to the 65 years and older. And it's just showing that we basically have, you know, increased consumption of drugs. And so that's going to be hard to compete with because people need those drugs, right? But the next issue might be how we get rid of them. You know, how do we dispose of them? And if you look at what we do now, in the US here, 54% of the disposal of drugs is in the trash. And 35% is flushed down the toilet. And in Canada, it's about the same. So that's how we currently get rid of these drugs. We put them in the environment, right? If we have excess compounds, we get rid of them by flush them down the toilet, put them in the landfill, right? Well, in British Columbia, they have a take-back program that the pharmacies run. You can bring compounds back, and they will take them back instead of throwing them in the trash. Now, I gave this talk up in British Columbia, and then somebody yells out in the back of the room, you know, they flush them down the toilet, you know. I don't think that's the case, but I mean, the issue is that if you wanted to try to minimize the source, you'd have to think about, is this something that's viable? In Clark County, Washington, they had a program since the 90s where you could take things to hazardous waste facilities. Well, probably not too many people did that. And then they started a pharmacy program in 2003. And Australia's been doing this. They have this kind of idea of product stewardship approach. Like, you know, you get it out there and somebody should worry about what happens to it. And based on their costs, there's been some estimates that the US could implement a take-back program at a cost of about $11 million a year. You know, to try to, again, take back some of these compounds and then hopefully dispose of them in a way, or you reuse them. I don't know what you're going to do with them, but maybe you could figure something to do with them. And then there's this other issue of limiting releases. Canada's author in Canada here, he argued that there were environmental costs to letting these things go. Now, how he computed this, I'm not sure, but he estimated that they could cost up to $100 million a year of the consequence of that. So that's just something for food for thought. Okay, we're done. And I just leave you with the last thought here, which is kind of how this pharmaceutical stuff, we don't have all the answers, and we're not even sure what to measure. And so what we're doing is we're out there trying to collect some preliminary information to see what's there and try to understand, is it ever going to be a risk, and work with that. So I'm done, and I really appreciate you staying here for your period of time here and hanging in with me. I certainly would entertain a few questions, and then I'll break you and let you bail out. And if somebody wants to come up and ask additional questions, I'd be happy to do that. So let's just take a few from the floor here. Yes?
Let me get them with the mic.
Okay.
Got to do my thing. Appropriate that you quoted Einstein. This is Pi Day, 3.14314, and it's also Einstein's birthday.
Do you have any questions for Garen?
How much control does the government have over the water leaving the states?
Now, you'd think I was supposed to know something like that, right? The issue is how much control does the government have over water leaving the states? Well, we have all kinds of agreements. You know, when they regulate Flathead Lake, You know, they worry about the salmon spawning on the Columbia River. And so some of that power generation that goes on and manipulation, we let water out at certain times for the fish that's because we have an agreement with them to do that. I don't know. It's a good question. I'm not a water rights expert, so I don't know that. I know when I worked in eastern Montana, there was the Tongue River Compact. And the Tongue River Compact said how much water Wyoming had to let over the border into Montana. You know, it didn't say anything about the quality of that water, which I always thought was interesting, but it did say that there was a certain amount of water that had to be delivered to Montana. So there are these compacts, there's international compacts with the US and Canada and other folks, but that's a good question about how much control like the federal government has over the state. The state has control of its water, but life gets complicated because there's all kinds of federal lands and they have different sets of rules, like the Forest Service lands and Indian reservations. They have a whole different set of laws related to their water. So,
If I may add,
Sure.
The Army Corps of Engineers and BLM, all those control a great deal of water flowing through the dams in Montana and throughout the whole Mississippi Valley, Tennessee Valley, that whole area.
because we're irrigating with that water, we're trying to do navigational things and
Floating barges down the Mississippi.
right. So there's lots of control on that water. Okay, that's the best answer to that. Yes.
Yeah. What happens to water that's used in like?
He's going to ask me something I can't answer. I know.
You don't know how many teachers have said that. What happens to the ground? What happens to the water that's used in flood irrigation? Like, how much happens to, like, does it taken in by crops? How much goes back to the groundwater?
Yeah, and it's an interesting question. I don't know whether I can answer it directly, but you're right on track. I mean, when you use water for irrigation, something happens to it, right? You either lose part of it because it evaporates. The plants use it into their plant cells or material, or they transpire it during their growth. It gets locked up and stored temporarily or in the soil, and also can have water stored in the groundwater as the water table fluctuates. But it's a water balance question. It's one that you can work on, actually, because it relates to having to measure each one of those components and trying to figure out what part of that water is actually being left behind or can move into the groundwater, and then the groundwater flows out and heads someplace else. So in the Bitterroot Valley, for example, if you look at the water table in the Bitterroot Valley, it will rise up in the spring and it will stay up all summer. And then it will drop off in the middle of September or so when the irrigation season sort of stops, and it'll drop like a rock. But it's because we're holding that whole groundwater system up because of the amount of excess water that's used in irrigation is recharging the groundwater locally, and it's keeping the groundwater system high. And it's feeding streams and having all other impacts.
Has anybody looked at concentrating the pharmaceuticals in plants as they use the water that contains trace amounts of pharmaceuticals?
Now, it's a good question. The question related to the concentration of the pharmaceuticals by plants, sort of a bioaccumulation, probably happens. I don't know. I haven't looked at that literature about how much of that happens. Certain things will bioconcentrate and certain things won't. And we have a plant pathologist in here, Dr. Running's old life, he used to be that, so he might be, or someone else in the audience might be able to help me with that, but I don't know. The answer is we don't know at this point. And I'm not aware of it. I'm not aware of the people working on it. I haven't seen the literature on it. A couple of more, and then I'll let you go. And if there's any extra water out there, please take it. I want it all to disappear.
Do you have any idea about what percent of the drugs that you find in the water came from what's disposed of? Maybe a lot of it's coming from people taking the drugs, metabolized various degrees, but it's excreted in urine and stool. So that part you cannot get rid of.
Yeah, I mean, the issue becomes if you need the drug, you're going to excrete it into the system, and that's just how it's going to be, because you're not going to say, I think I'll take less of that because I'm going to keep it out of the environment. But but I don't, I know when we did this work that we went through the books based on, when we did some other modeling and estimates, and we looked at how much you take and what comes out, what percentage of that's released from your system and in what forms and that kind of thing. So it is transformed and changed, but there hasn't, again, that's from the medical literature, right? That, you can look that up in a book and it'll tell you, well, if you take a certain amount, so much will be excreted, so much will be used and for certain weights and all that. But we haven't done that, we haven't done any controlled experiments. Like when we did sampling of septic systems, we have no idea what people were using. And it was all blinded so that we wouldn't even know who they were from. But the idea being that, there's a very interesting study in Italy, this is a side note, where they actually looked at cocaine use in this watershed by sampling the surface water. They could look at they could estimate the amount of cocaine that was being used in that whole area, and by the concentrations in the streams. So,
should we be concerned about the amount of de-icer that's going down on the roads? Is anyone testing for that? I know there's different levels of the chemicals in de-icer that you can use, and that maybe the city's making an attempt to lessen some of the more harmful chemicals.
The question was, what about the de-icers we use on the road? I could have told you that, I could have answered that question very clearly maybe 15, I'm looking at my wife, maybe 20 years ago, when my daughter did a science project looking at that exact question. But they've changed, I'm sure the concentrations have changed. I think Garen might know more about it as far as the chemistry of the de-icer.
Yeah, I've worked on that question with the Board of Health. We actually did sampling down at the Orange Street outfall and found lead and chromium were at high levels, but that turned out to be the yellow curb paint rather than the de-icer. We've since linked together with 5 states in the Northwest region, and there's now state standards for what the manufacturers of the de-icers have to shoot for as far as the contaminants in the de-icers go. The main concern was that the anti-corrosion agents in those de-icers are nutrients in the stream, so it's mostly been focused at the nutrient content. The trace metals haven't been so problematic.
And you all realize that those storm drains you see all over town, except for very few, they're just go into the aquifer.
They're called injection wells.
So, one more question, and I appreciate your patience.
With regards to the co-bed methane in eastern Montana, do they have, as far as the state of Montana goes, are there regulations on that water that is coming out of those wells at this time?
As far as I know, and again, unfortunately, even though it's been 30 years since I've been out there, I'm not directly working in that area, but that's been the big controversy, is that, the quality of that water has been kind of there was a moratorium put on that for a while, and it was to try to figure out, what are you going to do with the water? What kind of impacts is that water actually going to have? And I'm sure the state of Montana has TMDLs and other things associated with releasing that, how that water is released. The best way to do it would be to try to re-inject it, but the folks who have been trying to do that say it's very, very difficult to get that volume of water back into the system again. So they're mostly putting it in ponds and letting it evaporate or seep into the system. Or they have to build treatment plants. In Wyoming, they've actually built some treatment plants for some of the poor quality water and treated it and then dumped it into streams, into surface water. So.
But didn't you say it's very, the high saline?
It has high salinity and sodium in some areas, but the advantage of the cold bed methane development is that it's relatively good water compared to like a big oil well, which produces really lousy water. It also is a very known resource. The geology's all been figured out. Everybody knows where the coal is, so the risk level is pretty low to be able to do the development. And the cost of drilling a well, in this and finishing up your thing is $30,000 or $40,000, and so it's pretty shallow wells. So there's they know exactly what the costs are, but it takes 400 or 500 wells to start making any money. So it's a different thing than going out and guessing about where some big oil reserve is going to be, and that's why it's probably going to get developed, is because it's a pretty well-known resource, and they're going to come in and take it, and when it's all done, there'll be a bunch of wells all over the place, and there won't be any more gas, unless the bacteria will somehow regenerate it. So that could be. Okay, I think we're done.
Then I'll remind you that next week is our final lecture in the series. Neva Hassening is going to talk about food sheds.